This video is sponsored by MPB. One of the things any photographer worth their salt needs to teach themselves is how to see, how to recognize good light, and how to create it for themselves. So when I was starting out in photography, I spent a lot of time on a blog called Guess the Lighting, written by photographer Ted Sabarese. Ted would take images from some of the world's best photographers and try to break down for us how he thought those images might have been lit by posting lighting diagrams. And I found it so useful to see someone deconstruct the lighting in this way because it taught me to recognize things like the quality, direction, and color of lighting, which in turn helped me to recognize interesting light in my day-to-day wanderings or to create my own lighting in the studio. So I thought it might make for an interesting video, or maybe even series of videos if you want to see more of these. You can let me know down in the comments, to take one of the most iconic portraits ever made and to try and break down what I'm seeing in the lighting and how I think it was put together, and then to take you down into my garage studio to try and replicate those results for myself. This isn't an attempt to try and copy the image exactly, but rather just to try and emulate the look of the lighting, which is very, very different to my own style, and see what I can learn in the process. So the image I'm going to aim at in this video is this iconic shot of Ernest Hemingway by Yousuf Karsh, taken in 1957 at Hemingway's home in Cuba. Even though this exercise isn't meant to produce an exact copy of that original image, I still wanted someone with a beard to sit for this portrait because it's such a great feature of that original image. So in this video, you're going to meet my friend Ed, and you'll notice immediately that instead of wearing a high-collared jumper, he's wearing body armor with a collar. And the reason for that is he's been going back and forth to the Ukraine for the past few months to make and share photo stories and to volunteer where he can. I'm going to leave links to Ed's Instagram and his Patreon in the description below this video. He's a young photographer with a good heart, trying to make a difference in a very difficult situation. So if you'd like to go and see some of his work or find out about how you can support him, go and head over to those links and take a look. But let's kick things off by taking a closer look at Karsh's image and trying to work out if we can reverse engineer how he lit this famous portrait. Before we set anything up, let's take a close look at this portrait to see what we can learn. And the first thing is obvious. He has a nice black background behind his subject, means his subject really pops off the frame when he's lighting them. Then when it comes to lighting, I think he basically has a 3-light setup. He's got a rim light on either side behind the subject, probably around 45 degrees. I think this light sits higher just because you can see that there's more highlights on the top of the head over on the right-hand side than on the left-hand side. But on either side of the subject, behind and 45 degrees, we have these rim lights, which are just lighting at the back of the shoulders, the neckline of this jumper, the beard on the side here, and the hair on the top. And something interesting to learn that I noticed when looking at this portrait is if that's the case, which it obviously is, that's where he's lighting those two sides with, is sort of from behind the subject, then the ears here should also have specular highlights on them as well. But I think what happened in this case was Karsh decided that the ears were standing out too much. And so you can see he's burned the ears back in post so that they don't stand out with the highlights too much and they don't stick out too much, because he obviously felt they were distracting. And just another reminder that editing is not something that appeared with Photoshop. It's been around since the dawn of photography, right back to these sort of days where we were shooting just on film. Dodging and burning was something that happened often. And then our key light, or our fill light, is going to sit right overhead here and just slightly off to the right-hand side. And the reason I say that is for 3 reasons. One is you can see that the highlights on the forehead sit more on the right-hand side. 2 is that if we read the catch light in the eyes, we can see that it's off to the top right above the pupil, which is giving us a hint of the direction of that light. And then if we read the shadow of the nose, we can see that it's falling to the left, which suggests a light source over and above to the right. So our key light, which is probably going to be about half power of our rim lights off to the side, is going to be just overhead and slightly to the right. We can also see that the shadow cast underneath the nose is quite a hard edge shadow, which is quite interesting. He did used to use quite harsh lights. He liked to use a constant light, and he used the same sort of lights you'd use for a stage play. So there were constant bulb lights, tungsten in color, pushed through a Fresnel lens, so they're quite specular in their highlights. Especially for men, he liked this because it sculpted out the details on a face and the lines and the wrinkles and the hair and the beard and everything else. Sometimes he used to use a white sheet, diffusion sheet, if he wanted to break that light up a bit. But in this case, I think we have 3 quite hard light sources. And we have fancier softboxes these days, and I'm going to do a couple of things just to soften that slightly and make sure the direction is there, but I'm still going to keep the light sources themselves quite hard to keep the mood in the portrait. We can also see that he was allowing the lights to sort of flare a little bit into the lens because the sides of the frame are slightly darker. There's sort of a charcoaly look to the edges, whereas the middle is more of a deep black. So I'm going to let the light flare a little bit. If it is, I'm not going to worry too much about it. I think it's part of the look of the portrait. And then when it comes to the lens that he used, that's the only other thing to think about here, I think, is I guess when looking at this portrait that he shot this on roughly a 50mm focal length equivalent in 35mm terms. And then when I looked it up, I found that Karsh actually used an 8x10 camera with a 350mm lens, which roughly translate in 35mm terms to a 55mm. And I actually have a 55mm Zeiss lens, so that's the lens that I'm going to use. And I reckon that in this case, he was roughly speaking around f5.6 to f8 in 35mm terms for the depth of field that he's got here, because the face is all in sharp focus and it's only going soft by the back of the head here, by the back of the neckline and the back of the jumper on the shoulder. So I think what I'm going to do is shoot 55mm between 5.6 and f8 to give me a similar depth of field that he was getting out of his 8x10 camera with his 350mm lens. And I think that's enough information to start to build the look in the studio. So I've set everything up. I'll give you a quick little tour. This is my little garage studio. I've shown you around in another video. I'll link it below if you haven't seen it already, so you can see what sort of setup I've got here. Obviously, first and foremost, I've got this pop-up black background. We set a black background, so we'll keep that in place. For the rim lights, I've gone with these strip boxes, but I've pulled out the diffusion layers in between. So it's not a soft box anymore. It's just that bare bulb light source, which is going to come out quite hard and specular. I'm just using the sides of the softbox to keep the light shaped towards the subject so it doesn't spill all over the room. And the grid's going to help with that too, but no diffusion inside. Exactly the same on this right-hand one as well. I put this one slightly higher because I think that was how Karsh had it as well, slightly higher on that right-hand side to kind of match that look. So just strip boxes, but bare bulbs, no diffusion inside, and grid to keep everything shaped a bit. And then over this side here, I'll turn you around. That's my little test subject here, so you can sort of see as I'm setting things up, I can work out sort of what things look like, those 2 strip boxes in the background. And if we come around here from the subject's point of view, there's the camera with the, it's the A7R4, the Sony, with a Zeiss 55mm on it. And then that is my key light, just off to the subject's left, camera right, and overhead to try and match that light source. Now this light is, it's not what he used probably. I think he used a harder light source than this because it was very, very specular. That line, that shadow on the nose was very, very hard. But I want to just put my own spin on it. I wouldn't normally use that harder light on a portrait like this. We don't do that very often these days with portraits. So I still want that sort of harder light source than I normally use, but keep it just a little softer. So this is a Lenkata 16-pole collapsible beauty dish. It's got a white interior, which is going to give that slightly softer look, but the light source itself is not massive, so it's still going to be a harder light source than certainly I would normally use. But because it's a beauty dish, it'll bounce into the dish here, bounce out and come back out. So it'll be a slightly softer light source to fill on that key light from the front. And it's still overhead, slightly to camera right to sort of create that light shape and match it. The only other thing to say is on the sides here, I've also put black backgrounds against the walls, if you can see on both sides. And the reason that I've done that is so that I'm controlling any bounce from the light off the white walls. I don't want it to kind of fill back in. We want to create that dramatic sort of specular, moody lighting. So the black on the sides is just to help control some of the light that's bouncing around in this sort of light white space with these walls. Okay, so let's see what we can get in camera. Just to quickly mention what these lights actually are. The lights at the back are my old product lights, Bowen's lights. So they're Bowen's 400s. And the light overhead here is the AD200, the Godox AD200. And the trigger on this is for the Godox. This is a less powerful light than those studio strobes at the back there, those mains powered ones. but that's okay because that front light is going to be less powerful. So I'm just dialing that lighting the whole time, and I think I've got it about where it needs to be. The back lights are on almost the lowest power they can possibly be, kind of 1 out of 6. It's just a dial on the back of the Bowens lights. So maybe 1.2 out of 6, something like that. And this light here is on 1/4 power, and that's just filling in that front for me. The camera, as I've said, is the Sony a7R4, so it's a full frame Sony with the Zeiss 55mm lens on the front, which is going to give me about the equivalent, I think, that Karsh was using. Here's the view from the back of the camera, so you can sort of see that setup. And I like to shoot a test like this before my subject comes. I don't want to be fiddling around with lighting when my subject's actually here. So I'm trying to dial the lighting in before they even arrive to make sure everything's working well. And my settings, you can see, are ISO 100. I'm at f5.6, is giving me around the depth of field I want, and I'm at 1/250th of a second, which is almost my limit for kind of flash sync for these lights, so I need to be careful with that, but that's looking pretty good at the moment. And if I take a test shot now, let's see what we have. I've been playing around for about 5 minutes here, trying to dial this light in, and that to me looks pretty similar to what Karsh had. You can see those rim lights at the back. You can see that fill there on the front, which is less powerful than the rim lights at the back. And let's just zoom in a little bit and come down to my nose here, and you can see that the nose shadow is good. It's off to the left of the subject there, just like it was on his shot. It's a softer shadow because, as I said, I'm using a slightly softer light source. You can see the depth of field on the back looks pretty good. The fall off with the ears and the back of the head looks slightly softer. I think 5.6 is where I want to be. And the shoulder there you can see is going to be slightly out of focus, but the plane of the face itself is razor sharp in focus and looks pretty good. So I think I've now dialed the lighting in where I want it to be, and it's time to bring in my subject. We've only been shooting a couple of minutes. I've already realized the tripod is just getting in the way, so I'm going handheld. And the other little thing that I've done is just brought this black background closer to Ed, because some of the shadows on the side weren't quite deep enough. So just to make sure that there's more definition on that side, that we're really darkening things down, I brought that black flag a little bit closer to control the reflections. But otherwise, I think we're getting closer. Okay, so we've changed a couple of things. Let me just talk you through what we've done. So the first thing is, I've actually changed this light. We took the plate you can see on the front of the beauty dish. I tried taking the plate off the front because the light was just too soft. It didn't match at all what Karsh was doing. And then just taking that plate off the front, we kept the beauty dish on for a little bit and tried that. But again, it was still quite round and soft. Basically, I've switched out the bare bulb, which I had on the 8200, for one of these little round lights here. So it's more of a specular height now. It's much closer to what he had. Honestly, like, I'm not super comfortable with that kind of very hard lighting, but it does look better. So we've just gone with a much closer idea of the portrait that he captured on the day. How you doing? Sweating? It's very warm in here. Cool, we'll crack on. So we spent about 10-15 minutes shooting together and just trying a couple of different things with the lighting. I think we got maybe 40-50 images in total, just to try and dial the lighting in, get the right direction of the head and the direction of the eyes. And I think this is the closest one to the image that I'm aiming for. So what I've done is pulled it into Photoshop here. This is just a TIFF file. All I did was do a little tweak in Capture One just to make sure I've got all the detail that I want, but really I've done no editing to this as such. And I've also brought in our Hemingway portrait just as a reference layer above, so we can check in with this and make sure that we're going in the right direction. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a blank layer above, and I'm just going to do a little bit of healing, just not to take out too much. This is supposed to be a gritty portrait. I just want to take out little things like flyaway hairs here and the odd little thing on the skin just to clean it up a little bit, but I want to keep all the texture and the detail. I'm going to fly through this because I've already got a whole video on my process for this, which I'll link down below. I have a whole portrait editing series. So I'll crack on with this and check in with you in a second. The next thing I'm going to do is come down here to my black and white layer. I'm going to add a black and white adjustment layer above. This isn't yet to turn it black and white. We'll do that in a second. I'm going to bring my red channel down, yellow channel up just a little bit, and the blue channel up just a touch. Something like that looks pretty good. Lots of detail, looks really weird. But I'm going to come down here to my blending mode and change it to soft light. And what that's going to do is add a lot of edge contrast to the image as well. So sort of deepening the blacks, but also bringing out a lot of that detail in the skin too. It's way too strong, so I'm going to dial the opacity right down and then just slowly bring it up to, let's say, 20% looks pretty good. If I turn that off and on, you can see what that's done. It's just brought out a lot of the detail in the skin, and it's sort of crunched down those shadows a little bit and added that nice, like, tasteful edge contrast. Now, obviously, our target image is a black and white image, as we can see here. So let's do our black and white conversion. Now, the interesting thing about this image is it was probably shot on orthochromic film. An orthochromic film is a film stock which would do particular things to particular colors. You can see there's quite a lot of sort of blotchiness being brought out in the skin. And if you saw Hemingway then, his skin might have had a little bit of blotchiness to it, but definitely not this much, because what orthochromic film did was it would darken down particularly reds in the skin and bring out all that kind of weathered texture in the skin. If you want to see a great modern example of this, check out a film called The Lighthouse, which was brought out recently. The director is Roger Eggers. They filmed that film on orthochromic film using a cyan filter on the front of the lens, which had the effect of turning anything red in the scene very, very dark in the black and white mix. So if you saw blood in a scene, it would just look like oil. It looked so thick and rich. So orthochromic film had a very, very particular look to it, and that's what we're going to try and emulate here. So with our black and white image, we're going to come down here. We're going to select a black and white layer, another one above. Let me just turn Hemingway off. And we're going to come to our red channel and bring it right down. We want those blacks, the reds in the image to really appear dark. It's going to look very weathered. This isn't a flattering portrait look. It's supposed to show weathering. And obviously Ed has much better skin and is a much younger man than Hemingway was, but we're going to really bring out the texture in that skin. And then we're going to bring the yellows up a bit like this. And something like that is looking pretty good. And then we're going to take our blue channel, we're going to bring it right up, which is going to bring up his vest here at the bottom, which is great because we want the detail in that. And the cyans we're probably going to bring up as well. So something like that as a mix looks pretty good. That feels sort of orthochromic to me. Next thing we're going to do is a little bit of dodging and burning. So let's check out Hemingway portrait. All right, so we can bring out our highlights a little bit more. So let's come over here to curves. Change our curves layer to screen, and then I'm going to invert that mask, Control I to turn it to black. I'm going to select a brush. I'm going to make sure it's on white, 3% flow, so a nice soft brush, and we've got 0% hardness just to make sure it's nice and soft. And we're just going to paint in the highlights on that right hand side there where the light was falling. We're going to give a nice stripe down that right hand side of the nose, and then we're going to lighten up the cheek as well, where that light was falling. Again, I'm just accentuating the lighting that existed in the lighting that I actually set up. I'm not creating new lighting. I'm just bringing that lighting out. And that's looking pretty good, I reckon. I'm going to bring out the beard a little bit as well. And the mustache at the top. Anywhere where that light would fall on the top of something, so the top of the lip, the top of the chin here, the top of the cheek on the left side, top of the cheek on the right hand side, and that forehead on this side. So let's turn that off and on, and you can see what that's done, just bringing out the highlights on that side. Let's check our Hemingway shot. That looks pretty good to me. We could push it a little more, I reckon. Let's just bring out a little bit more. And maybe the bottom lip here as well. So that's looking fairly good. Then I'm going to do the opposite now. I'm going to add a burn layer. So another curves layer, and this time I'm going to change the multiply, change the blending mode to multiply on that curves layer, which is going to darken it right down. Control or Command I to invert. There's lots of ways to dodge and burn. This is just my chosen technique, which I quite like. It keeps a lot of the detail. Nice soft brush, 3% flow again. And I'm just going to burn down where the shadows are sitting now. So under the cheek here, under the cheek on this side, and under the hair here. And I'm also going to burn down some of the highlights on the hair here, because Ed has a nice sort of blonde hair, which means that it was catching the light a lot more than it was catching in Hemingway in his portrait. So something like that looks fairly good to me. Don't want to do too much more, I don't think. Then maybe the last thing I want to do now is to tone this portrait to closer match the Hemingway portrait. So let's turn it on above so we have a reference. Come down below, and we're going to add a curves layer underneath that Hemingway shot. So it's not affecting it, but it's just affecting my image underneath. And let's just pull a shallow S curve here, trying to get the highlights sort of closer to what he had. And that's looking pretty good. What I might do is add another curves layer above and just lift the shadows slightly to make them slightly more charcoaly, like they are in that portrait. And that, to my eye, is looking pretty close. I might just drag the sort of lighter of the shadows down a touch on this one above. And that, to me, is pretty close. We're obviously dealing with a very different man, a much younger man with very different skin, but I think we've gotten pretty close to the look. I think the lighting is matching pretty well. There are obviously differences. Ed has lighter hair, Hemingway has darker hair. Hemingway has a lighter beard because he's obviously got white in his beard. Ed has a darker beard. But that 3-light setup I think is pretty close, and it was interesting that it was going for that harder light source that really made the difference and brought the look of the two of them closer together. And I'm not unhappy with that. I think we've gotten pretty close to the spirit of what Karsh did in his portrait of Hemingway. This exercise taught me a few things, but probably the biggest was not to be so afraid of harder lighting. I mean, you saw me early on wanting to chicken out of using those 3 hard light sources by putting a beauty dish at least on that key light to soften things up a little bit. But the more I shot with it, the more I realized it was the wrong choice, and taking it off and using that harder light source really adds something for a gritty portrait like this. I think with starting out in portrait photography, we can all be tempted to go for the biggest, softest light sources we can because we know how flattering and forgiving that kind of light really is. But this exercise taught me that sometimes that harder light source can really create something interesting. Yes, it takes a bit more control and a bit more finessing, but the results can be quite dramatic, and it's definitely worth experimenting with. So my challenge to you is to choose a portrait photographer who lights in a very different style from you and attempt to emulate the results to see what you can learn from the process. And you don't need a ton of gear to do this sort of stuff. I could have taken this image today just with a black backdrop and 3 speed lights would have been absolutely fine. I could have got the same results. The point is to attempt something new, to see what you can learn from trying on someone else's style. And that doesn't mean you're going to switch styles entirely overnight. I know I won't because I like my style, but it may give you more ideas for your work and more tools to put in your photography toolbox. I'm trying out a new sponsor on my channel this week, so I'd like to thank MPB for sponsoring this episode. They're a great platform online for buying and selling used camera gear. Throughout my photography career to date, I've usually purchased used camera gear because if you buy through a reputable seller, you end up saving a load of money and end up with the same great quality in your work. Buying from MPB means you'll get a fair price for the cameras or the lenses that you're buying based on the condition of the equipment, and you'll get a 6-month warranty for peace of mind. Similarly, if you find that your cupboards or your camera bags are filling up with gear that you don't really get much use out of anymore, it happens to all of us, MPB will buy that used equipment from you. And I like the idea that then it gets loaded onto their platform where it stands a chance to get picked up by another photographer to be part of their kit and part of the stories that they're going to tell. Getting a quote for your camera or your lens is easy on their platform, and if you're happy with the price, they'll even send a courier to your door to pick up your equipment so you don't need to make a trip to the post office. So whether you're looking to purchase a quality used camera body or lens to add to your equipment, or you find you're just collecting too much gear and you need to sell some of that gear on, I'm going to leave a link to MPB down in the description. Click the link, head over and check them out.